So now that we've talked about briefly how much disability support services have helped me and improved my quality of life living with ME, and acknowledge just how hard they are to access, I want to step back for a moment to talk about where they come from. How did they get established? Um, and what's the history there? So first, I want to note we could dedicate an entire webinar series to the history of disability advocacy. That's not what we're doing today. I'm just giving you a tip of the iceberg preview so that you understand the historical context of these services that we're talking about. So there was a lot of work happening at the same time that all of this work that was going on that I'm going to talk about today, but sorry, we're specifically focusing on the cross-disability efforts here that are most relevant to our community of people with infection-associated chronic illnesses. Okay, so back to the slide. I want you, our community, to know that chronically ill and disabled people who came before us fought for their right and our right to access supports and services. In fact, we may have more in common with these people than you might think because many of them were also disabled by infections. For example, Judy Heumann, who is pictured on the left here holding the sign 504 regs now sign, was disabled by a virus, polio. She and other disability activists fought for Section 504, which was the first civil rights protections for people with disabilities. If you have seen the film Crip Camp on Netflix, you may be familiar with some of these stories. At the same time, in the 70s, Ed Roberts started the first Center of Independent Living in Berkeley, California. The National Independent Living movement started with this, and it really shifted the framework of disability away from the medical model. The independent living movement instead pushed for peer support, advocacy, and information. And these are all common themes today among our chronic illness communities. I promise this is relevant to what we're talking about today with Canary Corps. One of the programs that was life-changing for me as a person with ME was home and community-based services with Medicaid. It allows me to pay my husband and a caregiver I hired using Medicaid dollars to support my daily life at home living with ME. We'll talk more about that program in a later slide, but here's a little glimpse into how this service came to be. A whole collection of advocacy and policy change led to home and community-based services with Medicaid to make it possible for chronically ill and people with disabilities to receive care at home today instead of an institution. This started in the 80s and advocacy continues today. The Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act was part of that work, and so was the 1999 Olmstead Supreme Court decision. I specifically wanted to highlight that Supreme Court decision, the Olmstead, because one of the plaintiffs in this historic case, pictured on the right there, has an infection-triggered disability. So this is our final slide on the historical context. Like I said, a super brief overview, just the tip of the iceberg. There was a lot going on at this time, but I specifically wanted to highlight these last few things today because they affect people with ME, long COVID, and infection-associated illnesses today. So in 2008, we saw the broadening of the term disability in the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. And for our community, this helps ensure people like us who may have fluctuating dynamic disabilities, it helps ensure that we can be protected from discrimination under the ADA by fitting that broader definition of disability. And in 2010, the Affordable Care Act, which had a variety of benefits for people with ME and related conditions, like prohibiting discrimination based on pre-existing conditions so people like us could actually access health insurance coverage. It created the essential health benefits, and that set a standard for comprehensive care that needed to be offered from insurers. And finally, the money follows the person. That pushed states to shift from institutional care towards community-based care, just like what I receive today from Medicaid in being able to pay my husband and a caregiver for services in my home. So now the moment you've probably been waiting for, as we've talked about the history. How does that history affect people living with long COVID, ME, and other chronic illnesses today? The disabled and chronically ill people who fought for our rights and fought for various services may have had different diagnoses than us, but we have a lot in common. They were not just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for everyone now and into the future. Today, living with chronic illness and disability has a huge impact on our daily life. It can be so difficult to make ends meet financially. Households with a chronically ill or disabled family member need an extra 28% of income for the same standard of living as non-disabled households. I'm going to say that again. They need an extra 28% of income to have the same standard of living as non-disabled households. This is a recent statistic per the National Disability Institute. Beyond just making ends meet financially, it can also be hard to just keep up with the daily tasks of life. These are tasks like preparing meals, doing laundry, bathing, getting dressed, going to the doctor, going to the grocery store, picking up prescriptions, things that people with chronic illnesses often have difficulty with on a regular basis. So, bringing it all together, we know how living with disabling chronic illness impacts our daily life. We know how hard it is to get help or support for it. And now we know a little bit about the history of what previous disability advocates have fought for. The services they've fought for can help us today by making it possible to meet our daily needs and giving us a chance at making ends meet financially. But we know how hard it is to access these services, and this is exactly where the Canary Corps program comes in. It's designed to help connect our community with these kinds of supports and services.